Good evening. My name is Janae Hunter, and today my team and I will be presenting and bringing awareness to the topic of gun control, specifically in America. Now, as you all may know, be familiar with, or have seen in the news, the topic at hand has become very prevalent in society over the past few years due to the increasing rate of fatality by gun. And there's also been this big debate on if the government needs to get a firmer grip due to this increasing rate or if they even have the power to based on the Second Amendment rights. But what we do know is in America alone, every year on average, there's around 36,000 fatalities and a lot more, over 76,000 injuries due to some form of gun violence. And these forms include, but are not limited to, murder, suicide, legal interventions, and some form of domestic violence. So, who actually has these guns in America? Well, the overall population is around 327 million American citizens, but according to Christopher Ingram with the Washington Post, there are more than 393 million civilian owned firearms in the United States alone. This is enough for every man, woman, and child to own a gun, and there still be 67 million guns left over. Aside from the civilian-owned firearms, law enforcement also has around 1 million firearms, which equates to around a 1 to 6 ratio, 6 guns to every one officer, and then the military has around 4.5 million firearms. Okay, so who can actually have these guns legally in America? Well, federal and state laws have been put into place to detail who is fit to own a gun, and federal law is basically just saying who is eligible to purchase or have a permit, and then state is just adding further restrictions to certain categories of certain people. All right. And there have been certain acts put into place over the years to contain these weapons a little bit more, and some of those acts include the National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act, which is the big one, the Gun Free School Zone Act, and then the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which put in place background checks in order to purchase a gun. Okay. And to make this simpler, I'm going to say who cannot purchase guns in America under federal law. So under federal law, you cannot purchase a gun if you have been convicted of or under indictment for a crime punishable by imprisonment for a year or more. You're a fugitive of injustice. You are an unlawful user or addict to a controlled substance if you are underage. And the underage law includes handguns, licensed handguns, 21, licensed long guns, you have to be 18, but for unlicensed handguns, you have to be 18, and then unlicensed long guns, it's crazy. You don't have to have any age. There's no age minimum for possession or to have ammunition. But others under federal law include if you have been discharged from the military, if you have renounced your citizenship, or if you have been convicted of a misdemeanor offense of domestic violence. All right, and under state law, there is a few more categories that go more in depth to if you can purchase a gun in their state, and some of these include violence or gun-related misdemeanors, dangerously mentally ill, drug and alcohol abusers, and then juvenile offenders. And here's just a list of the states, and if you're able to purchase a gun based on these categories within the states. And if you look at Tennessee, you are not able to purchase a gun if you have a gun misdemeanor, if you are dangerously mentally ill, if you are a drug or alcohol abuser, but you can if you are a juvenile offender. Now, if you look at Arkansas, it's complete opposite. You can purchase a gun if you have a gun misdemeanor, if you are a drug abuser, if you do abuse alcohol, but you cannot if you are dangerously mentally ill. So next, my teammate is just going to go over what guns look like in America.
Gun control in the United States seems to be a perpetual problem amongst many citizens, and basically, when people think of gun control, they refer to it as a legal matter to where its purpose is to restrict the possession or even the use of any firearm. But but throughout other more developed countries, it seems to be the gun control seems to be more strict and as less controversial or uncontroversial to a point where there's more discipline with this matter. Gun control in the United States seemingly is the most controversial conflict within this country due to the fact that it has the highest homicide rate by the use of a firearm compared to the more developed countries. And when I say developed, I'm talking about the high income countries such as the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, and so on, Germany. And but the controversy is surrounded by the fact that some people may argue that firearms should be as as less accessible because it will obviously save lives and reduce crime, opposed to the citizens that will say, "Hey, look, we can use these firearms to defend ourselves against other criminals that may be armed." And so there's a lot of debate surrounding this topic in the US. And of course, there's a lot of factors that influence a lot of these mass shooters to go wild with this. And a lot of American lawmakers have come to a consensus that video games or mental illnesses play a big role in these shootings today, as a lot of Americans are depicted as having a large obsession for guns, and this is a policy that's been looked at for years now, to where they need to limit the lethal weapons that are accessible to a lot of citizens in the United States. To a lot of In 2019 alone, there's been over 250 mass shootings in the U.S., and at least over 45%, or roughly around 45 or 46% of civilians in the U.S. own fire guns. And this, of course, results to the rate of gun deaths increasing, which is a remarkable number. And this is all according to the data collected by Gun Violence Archive. By moving on to gun control in other countries, for instance, in the UK, it is a lot more stricter to the point where there's no self-defense and citizens just being able to purchase these weapons nearby. And so if one is to own a firearm in the UK, they're usually seen as a criminal who has possessed this object illegally. So therefore, their homicide rates aren't as high as, or even close to, the U.S.'s rates. And this can also be said for Japan, who have a zero tolerance rate for gun ownership in the country, and which is completely and definitely stricter. Completely. In countries such as Australia and Germany, you can have a license to own a gun for leisure or hobby aspects, and but people are usually trained not to use on other individuals, and so there's a lot of strictness throughout that. And this is where the U.S. could definitely learn.
Hey guys, my name is Jack Edwards, and our group is going to be talking about gun control in the United States and in other countries as well, and how these laws could be passed for gun control, or like what gun control looks like in other countries, etc. My subtopic is how mental health plays a part in gun control and how background checks can possibly reduce the violence in the United States. So yeah, I believe that people should be background checked before being allowed to buy a gun, and show like medical records to be able to buy a gun. I would say that most mass shootings and male suicides are caused by people that have mental illnesses. So I believe a buyer should have to show these records before purchasing a gun. So mental illness is defined as like the inability to cope with one's ordinary demands of life. There is no cure for mental illness. Yeah, so there's two parts of recoveries for these mental illnesses. One, you can stabilize the symptoms and restore social functions by taking medicine or pills or going to therapists, stuff like that. And then the second one is changing one's attitude and feelings and developing a new meaning in one's life. And so statistics for these mental health and mass shootings, according to the Mental Illness, Mass Shootings, and the Politics of American Firearms by Metzel, nearly 20% of Americans are coping with mental illnesses, and 4% have severe mental illnesses. 5% of these people engage in violent crimes or acts. I know this is not a huge number, but this being said, mental illness still has a very large part in the support for firearm legislation and gun control. Current policies suggest that mental illnesses promote violence, especially when gun accessibility is increased. Reports suggest that 60% of people that cause mass shootings in the U.S. since 1970 displayed symptoms of mental illnesses. People with schizophrenia have 65 to 130% greater chance of committing a crime over the general public. So people with these diseases are much more likely to commit these crimes and these mass shootings. So yeah, background checks to acquire a gun. As of now, an unlicensed seller, those are people who sell guns online, sell guns at gun shows or other places without a federal dealer's license. They can transfer firearms without having to run a background check. So basically anybody can get a gun from them. So 22% of U.S. gun owners acquired their latest firearm without a background check. 80% of all firearms acquired for criminal purposes are obtained through transfers from unlicensed sellers. A few years ago, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System was instilled, and now background checks take less than 2 minutes. So this being said, there's no reason for background checks to not be more prominent in buying a gun. So now I'm going to talk about the background check process. So all federally licensed locations must background check. The Gun Control Act of 1968 prohibits a person to be sold a firearm if he or she deemed a danger to himself, herself, or others, or lacks the mental capacity to contract or manage his or her own affairs. Federal law does not require states to submit information to the NICS, and that's the National Institute Criminal Background Check System. Yet, state law states that they should report to the NICS when a person is determined mentally ill. So in conclusion, I believe that a person with a mental illness should not be allowed to buy a gun because of the statistically larger chance to commit a large crime like this. I believe that a person should be background checked and should have to bring their medical records to the place that they are buying the gun in order to purchase the gun. Yeah, thank you.
My topic for our group presentation is the gun control legislation process, what that process looks like, and how or if it can be enforced in the United States. Now, there are two opposing sides to this issue, but what I hope is to educate the listener on the legislation process of gun control so that they can then be better suited to form their own opinion on the topic. So we all know that the Second Amendment of the Constitution grants every American individual the right to bear arms for self-defense purposes. However, there are very different interpretations of the relevance of the Second Amendment today. Many think that it is now not as important to protect ourselves from our government or from other people as it was previously when the amendment was added to the Constitution, when our country was being founded, which was very long ago. And these different opinions or interpretations have thus created opposing arguments on the issue. One that hopes to keep our right to bear arms that is stated in the Second Amendment of the Constitution, and one that is in favor of imposing stricter gun laws and regulations in the United States today. Now, one driving question for this argument is if we can completely get rid of the guns that are already out there today. Now, I think that it would be possible to destroy the guns that have serial numbers that can be tracked and that are legal. Those guns could be destroyed, but I also believe that the guns that are in high demand on the black market that have no serial number and cannot be tracked could not be destroyed. There'd be no way for our government to find them, and thus criminals would have access to those firearms anyways. Another driving question would be if it is possible to enforce a complete ban on guns. We can kind of compare it to the black market on drugs, especially marijuana. There have been rules and regulations in the past for this drug specifically that have banned it completely, and still people used it recreationally and medically, regardless whether it was legal or not. So one option that we've had available to this point for gun control regulation have been background checks, especially when dealing with mental health issues, and they have been largely ineffective to this point in decreasing the possibility of mass shootings and homicides due to the differing opinions in what a mental health issue looks like and to what degree of a mental health issue would not be allowed to obtain a gun. So finally, the final question would be, who legislates the issue? Is it our state governments? Does it come down to our federal government? And how do the differing in opinions make that this legislation process harder? So as we know, many of our state governments in the United States disagree and differ in opinion on this topic. Even so, the federal government, according to the Constitution, their decision always trumps the opinion of our state governments, meaning that if the federal and state governments disagree, there is often no solution to the gun control issues that we face in the United States today. There is a very good example. Washington, D.C. in 2008 tried to pass a ban on guns, and it was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. This shows the inability of the two to make a decision and come to a conclusion on the issue, and just makes the legislation process way harder. So in conclusion, it is nearly impossible to successfully regulate and enforce gun control on a national level, as there are way too many factors that come into play regarding the logistics of enforcing laws that can and will be placed by the U.S. government. So maybe the only way to truly successfully legislate this issue might be to amend the Constitution so that we can then put parameters around who has the right to bear arms.
In my opinion, there's a thin line between self-defense and the deadly force of guns. I believe that gun control should be enforced and protected more than it is today. People owning guns is a basic American right that we all have, but I believe that the government should have more laws about who can buy and have access to guns. Without restrictions on who can own a gun, depending on the state that you live in, as long as you're 18 or 21 in some states, you can get your license to carry. This makes it easy for criminals, the mentally ill, and even young children have some type of access to get their hands on a gun. If we were to have a government that would enforce laws, we could possibly have a decline in the amount of deaths each year by guns. A big reason that people feel like they need guns is for protection. Having a gun handy makes us feel safer and have a defense weapon if we were ever to need one. However, if we were to have better gun control, we would feel safe knowing that it wasn't just so easy for anyone to get their hands on such a dangerous weapon. 5 states, including California, Florida, Illinois, New York, and South Carolina, prohibit people from carrying handguns in public. However, 31 states allow the open carrying of handguns without any license or permit. In some cases, guns must be unloaded, but still this makes it possible for anyone to get their hands on a gun, which can lead to more shootings, mass shootings, and deaths. People disagree about gun control laws. A main reason that people have is that they need to carry a gun in order to feel safe, which many people can understand in today's day and time. However, we have others in this world who do not have good intentions if they were to have a gun. Many deaths and mass shootings could have been avoided if guns were not so easy to come by. Although we do not always know someone's intentions with guns, some people have tragic events that happen in them that can cause them to act out in a way that they would normally not do. It could have been prevented if the United States had gun control laws. Without gun control, it is way too easy for anyone to get their hands on such a dangerous weapon. In 2018, around 40,000 people's lives were taken from a gun. I believe that if we regulate guns, some of these deaths could have been avoided.